Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Writing Life. I'm Stephen W. Long, and my guest today is Jose Araguz. And Jose's been on a couple of times before. We just have a lot to talk about. A little bit different today. Jose is a poet and a professor at Linfield. And so we've talked about his poetry. Today, the emphasis is going to be you're a judge, or a poetry judge for Paper Gardens.
Yes.
So first, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's nice to have you back. We're going to shake this up just a little bit. You've been nominated for, to talk about.
Oh yeah, the good news is I've been nominated for the Oregon Book Award.
There you go.
I'm a finalist for in the poetry category, and I'm just really grateful. It's nice to be kind of recognized and
absolutely
embraced by the community, as I have been since moving back a couple of years back. And just the writers here, the writing community is just very generous and welcoming. And this is just another sign of it. So,
and when you say the community, that's not just our town.
Right. I mean, also, let's see, within my first year coming back, I did a reading at the Windfall Reading Series in Eugene, Oregon, so the Eugene Public Library.
Okay.
With my friend Sam Roxas Chua, who I know from way back. And also things like terroir and fire writers, the fire writers conference, which we had a couple weeks back this month.
Okay, and again, we're going to get to the judging, but talk about fire writers. I know I've heard that term.
Yeah.
We talked about it a little bit, and
oh yeah, no, it was a great event. It was a conference spearheaded by a grant that was gotten by Deborah Weiner and Lisa Olin Harris. It was a one-day conference for high school students from across Yamaha County. And it had everybody from Fonda Lee to...
Tracy?
Tracy Doherty was there. Kathy DeGoots was there as well. And just writers coming together to do workshops with high school students. Let's see, Kim Stafford was there. He did a keynote address. And slam poet Alex Dang did a slam poem to open the event. Yeah. And I gotta say, I had a lot of fun. I did 2 sessions, and in both sessions, I was really impressed by the enthusiasm that the high school students had for creative writing. Yeah,
and I'll tell you, that is heartening to me, and we've had other guests talk about this. I think as an older person, somewhat removed from that generation, I can get, or we can get, information that maybe isn't comprehensive. In other words, what shows up on the news? Well, it's the bad stuff, not the good stuff. And it's great to hear that people are enthusiastic about that, and that you're generous enough to mentor them.
Oh yeah, it's something that's mattered to me for years now, since getting my bachelor's and on through the rest of my education and teaching career, is always passing it forward. Like, there's no reason to get an education and get these tools without wanting to share them and help people. Yeah.
Right. I know I've started much later than you did, but writers, authors have always sort of been my heroes rather than astronauts and firemen. And when I had the opportunity to sort of get into that milieu, got to meet some great people. Richard Ford is a Pulitzer Prize winner. And it impressed me, and it was gratifying how generous they are, how welcoming they are. They're not trying to keep their secrets. They welcome you in. So now it's your turn.
Now it's my turn, and I always tell my students, writers find writers. Yeah. So don't. It's one thing, like, I mean, writing does require some solitude, some time with the page and everything, but no one's going to come knock on your door and say, "Oh, we hear that you've been, working on something. What is it?" Publication doesn't work that way. Neither does a writing community. Yeah. So you got to go out there and participate in open mics, or just send your work out too. That's community as well. Right. And especially one of the things that's been great to see in the past 10 years is the role social media plays in writing communities. People who may not be able to meet each other physically, getting in touch with each other. I've mentored people from afar. Through Twitter, through email, and yeah, it's been great.
And so, this is a different topic too, but like all of these innovations, with cell phones, or I suppose telegraph when it was first came out. It's a mixed bag. There's good and bad, and we sure hear, again, a lot about the bad, how it maybe leads to depression and so on. Here's a good use for social media.
Oh, yeah. Especially there's you take a community like the disabled writer community. They were able to meet each other, find each other, and form literary journals and just get in touch with each other through social media.
Right.
You mentioned the telegraph, and I'm just like, the way writers react to technology. I always remember that Robert Frost, one of his exercises that he did for himself was to create telegraphs without any punctuation, without ever having to say stop.
Okay.
With just one sentence.
Okay.
And if you read his poems have that dexterity as well in terms of sentences.
Oh, that's interesting. No, I didn't know that.
And I mean, now the parallel would be writers writing poems or even like essays in 140 characters, which is the Twitter format. So
I understand that, at least in Japan, that stories are written in that because particularly young ladies read them on the bus on the way to work, which is kind of a different thing. Mm-hmm. So let's get to the judging, get to the poetry.
Sure.
You're a successful, well-known poet. You teach poetry. You were picked to be the judge. I'll be the devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. It seems that it's so capricious or arbitrary. How do you judge something like that? How do you judge that kind of work?
Oh, it's just like my approach to writing, whether it's teaching or assessing writing, whether it's teaching or just a friendship, a one-on-one mentorship, and then judging a contest. Bottom line, generosity. Like you gotta approach the work at hand, writer to writer. So you know, being a writer myself, it's like I know how hard it is to write something, and then to have the nerve to and the bravery to submit it, to put it into play.
Sure.
You have to respect that. So starting there, and then that's where this generosity does balance. What ultimately comes into play next is somebody's taste. So my own bias.
Right.
I'm not going to say biases. I'm going to say taste. I'm going to say aesthetic.
I think that's better.
Yeah, that's a better term because I'm not out to favor one over another, but my aesthetic, I temper it with generosity, but I'm also aware of my aesthetic, so that if I find myself like putting in maybe piles, like poems that I naturally maybe are like mine, I'm like, wait, let me find other poems that are not like what I write, just to see what that's like,
right.
and then kind of learn that way myself. So it's always a learning process too for me. So
you kind of anticipated me. I was going to ask you, have you come across anything that would be unusual for you, but then maybe a little bit of education or revelation? Say, wait a minute, this is not normally me, but it's really good. I like it for some reason.
Oh yeah, no, and I go through this similar kind of process, reading for Airly Press, which I'm an editor for, and there's an online journal called Right Hand Pointing. I'm an editor for that as well, and I keep these ideas in mind, where it's like read generously, but also read openly with your aesthetic in mind. And the openness does let me read like, I normally, if I'm always writing about family, let me read somebody like, I don't know, Kay Ryan. Mind you, I haven't been in a position to like judge Kay Ryan's work,
right.
But like Kay Ryan's work is, moves away from the personal to get personal. So, and it fascinates me. So I teach her poems, even though they're vastly different than what I write.
Okay.
I find that engaging. And so, yeah, in judging, I'm always looking for like, honestly, it comes down to part of that generosity too is being a enthusiastic reader of poetry.
Okay.
Like if I'm just looking to see something that excites me. Since we're talking about judging, the first time I got asked to judge a poetry contest, I think I was 19. It was down in Corpus Christi, Texas, South Texas, and it was a county-wide writing contest. And I remember being kind of, I read blindly, but I was kind of...
And what do you mean by that?
Oh, what I meant by that is I didn't know, I saw names, but I didn't know ages.
Okay.
But it was an all-age thing. And I think Paper Garden has categories, kind of separates ages,
right.
But this was, everybody was thrown in the mix. So I was really like surprised and charmed by my top 3 picks. I believe the first pick was a third grader's poem about a fruit bowl, and it was just marvelous. It was like something like William Cullen Williams' level
Isn't that something?
Of imagery.
Right.
The second place piece was a Vietnam veteran writing about his experiences, and then the third place person was a teenager writing about a heartbreak. And so just that mix, I was just like, wow.
That's
and
fabulous.
It was such a lesson of like, well, I'm responding to what excites me when I read it.
Right.
So.
I had done an interview about my book one time, and the guy, he asked me, do you think a reader could relate to something that they haven't experienced? Because the profession of this person was a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And I said, I think we read at least for two reasons. And one is to validate our own lives, and then one is to experience something that we never have, or maybe even couldn't. Mm-hmm. So if you read about a mining colony on Mars, well, I've never done that, but maybe this lets me think about it. And it sounds like you're doing that with the poems too.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Because that's part of what we got to keep in mind too. It's like, what are we relaying? What are we evoking for our readers? What is the gift that we're creating through the act of writing for others? Because it's only so much ours. Like, especially if we want to share, we want to publish. Right. This piece, it may not be for a reader that I ever meet, but I have to work on it just as hard, so that whenever that reader does find it, it could be someone far away, it could be someone years from now who finally reads it and needs that poem or needs that story.
Isn't that great?
Yeah, it's a great way to connect.
You may know the quote that I can't remember. I was in a writing group that we had both poetry and fiction and so on. And there was a woman in there who wrote, I thought, fabulous poetry. I very often didn't get it. Nevertheless, I liked it very much. And there's a quote about that. Does that ring a bell at all?
Not immediately,
okay.
But I know that feeling.
Yeah.
And
it's the word choice, it's the cadence, it's something, the imagery that it's just, I don't care what it's about. I just love it.
Yeah, I think that's something. In the same way that I was 19 and I judged this contest, and it became this moment. Because my decision was like final. So, given that authority, I didn't take it too lightly. I was like, no, I want to, pick things that I can stand by, and that was fun. Another formative experience was getting to grad school and seeing people be just really the opposite, really ungenerous, really like. Tearing poems apart, or
was this a competitiveness? Do you think,
it was, yeah, there was
jealousy?
A little bit of both. More competitiveness, but you're competitive, and some jealousy is going to sneak in. And I remember, in the face of all that, saying to myself like a kind of mantra of, "It's not my poetry that matters; it's poetry that matters." That's really the lesson.
Good for you.
And so I just kind of kept saying that to myself in the face of like all this infighting and yeah, like I said, it's formative. It just kind of humbled me. So I've always been pushed to. Yeah. I tie it to pushing myself to read for what I'm into, but also what I'm not into. What's not myself.
Sure.
Just to get to know it, just to see.
Sure. I suspect, just from what you've said, that you're. This is one of the aspects that makes you a fine teacher and also a fine judge. And I think maybe that's why you were picked. That's what they're looking for.
I hope so. Yeah. And I hope to honor them selecting me for sure.
Okay. So now you're judging for Paper Gardens, the poetry section of this. We talked a little bit before we started recording here about the time. And this is this year?
So I have Deborah Weiner was kind enough to send me an official blurb, so I think I'll read that.
Yeah, do.
And it'll say it more articulately than I can.
I doubt that.
I don't know. Let's see, and we'll make sure to get the dates right. Okay, so the official Paper Gardens info. Paper Gardens is open to children, youth, and adults who live, go to school, or work in Yamhill County. Last year we received about 550 entries with 27 schools participating. The Arts Alliance of Yamhill County sponsors Paper Gardens, and the Chehalem Cultural Center hosts our event. Financial support this year comes from McMinnville Kiwanis and the McGuinville Noon Rotary. Writers should not be discouraged if the work is not selected. We encourage everyone to try and try again. In recognition of how much effort and courage it takes to enter, we award mini journals or seed books to all students, grade 1 through 12, who submit, whether or not they are selected for publication.
Okay.
And let's see, what else to say? Entries are due March 1st. I believe I'll be judging through March and April. And then we have the big ceremony, May 9th at 7 o'clock at the Chehalem Cultural Center.
Okay.
And what happens, the winners get published in the book and then get a copy of the book as well. And,
Great.
And the ceremony on May 9th is a book release kind of.
Okay,
there as well.
gotcha.
And the other thing I'll add too is that they also encourage people to submit in Spanish.
Oh, great.
Poetry and prose. And I talked to Deborah Weiner and I said, hey, do we have anybody who is going to be judging those specifically? Because I'd like to go ahead and, because I write in Spanish, I teach in Spanish. I've done writing in Spanish. So yeah, I encourage people to, if Spanish is their first language or they just want to try something out, or they feel more comfortable and they got stories in that language, to go ahead and submit as well. You
have reminded me, I think you and I talked about what a different language can bring.
Yes.
And I think we were talking about gender. Does that ring a bell? We were talking, yeah, something could be a male noun or
yeah, the rules of language, yeah, they vary. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a great opportunity being able to draw on that. So, having said that, you have something to read as well.
Yes, actually, I thought it would be, since we're talking about what it's like to judge and we're talking about Paper Gardens, I've selected a couple pieces to read from last year's book. This is last year's book.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'll read something and then share what I like about it. And I had no part in selecting these,
right.
But I can tell, like, oh, I'm hoping that through my comments you'll hear kind of how I read selections. So
sure.
And would be judging them. So this first one is in the Youth High School Free Verse category. This is Vanessa Hernandez from Amity High School. And her poem is entitled, I Remember. I remember walking in the room, dark, the human version of the sun being the only thing lighting us up. It's as if it was yesterday. 11 years ago, I held him. Frightened that I would drop him, I held him. His white paws shivering. He was so tiny. He could have fit in any small space. He made a little squeal. I thought I'd hurt him. Scared, I handed him to someone else. He looked at me. I remember. So I picked this one because something, and I just taught a Jan term, so I just went through a 4-week introduction to creative writing course, and the students were great over at Linfield. The students were great. They did a lot of hard work, a lot of writing within 4 weeks. And so that's where my head is right now in terms of grading and provoking and encouraging my writers. So I picked this poem because it does something that I'm not always a fan of, where it hides what it's talking about. But I think it handles it well. And if you've ever held a scared pet during a storm, and that is what it is. It's like they're not human. They can't admit that they're scared. And even a dog. I remember we were dog sitting at one point, and a dog will pretend that it's not scared, but then they become like double their weight, and they sink, and they want to be on your lap.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And so I feel like this poem captures some of that, where it's like the fear that's in the animal and the awareness of the speaker happen kind of in tandem.
Yeah.
So that was nice.
Jose, remind me, what age group was this?
Youth high school. So high school age.
Okay. No, that's wonderful.
Yeah. Let's see. I really like that we have a haiku category in the Paper Gardens. And so this is the Youth Middle School Haiku by Anna Kabursky from Patton Middle School here in McMinnville. And the haiku is entitled Painting. Watercolor thoughts bleed together as tears drip. Brush strokes, warped paper. I'm going to read that one again. Yeah, I'm going to read that again. Yeah. Because haikus happen faster than we catch. Watercolor thoughts bleed together as tears drip. Brush strokes, warped paper. And actually, I taught haiku at the Fire Writers Project too, so I'm conference, and so I have haiku on the mind. It's something that I'm always teaching, always writing myself. what I like about this is it's going from the abstract watercolor thoughts. I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. And then bleed together as tears drip. So we get into the physical. And then brushstrokes, warped paper. So we kind of start in the human world and we end up at warped paper with, and something's happened. Like it's gone from thoughts to the very thoughts themselves have affected the physical world in 3 lines. And I'm like, ooh, that's nice.
It's real tactile in the paper part.
Yeah.
That's great. Boy, that's good for this age.
Yeah.
I think it's good for any age.
So exactly, and that's, I'm not always a fan of reading blindly or blind submissions where the name's taken out. I understand why it's done. It's done a lot for, in case you know someone, their favoritism and all that. But I like knowing. I like knowing just so I have that much more to respect.
A little background, maybe?
Yeah, a little background. But ultimately, when you read something like this, it takes you out of yourself. And it's like, it doesn't matter where exactly, or the age doesn't exactly matter. It's what's happened on the page. Yeah.
Okay. I want to ask you 2 things about haiku.
Yeah.
This is a little silly, but I have heard that there is controversy about, does the title count as one of the words?
I've heard a little bit of this controversy. Haiku traditionally don't get titles.
And maybe that's why.
But then you get a situation like the Ezra Pound poem. Ezra Pound has a poem called "In the Station at the Metro," and that's the title. And the poem itself says, and mind you, I don't think I have this memorized, but it's something. My approximation is the apparition of the faces of the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And so it's a 2-line poem. But when I teach it sometimes, I'm like, well, this is a haiku in hiding, because with the title,
there you go.
So in the station at the metro, the apparition of the faces of the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, then it has that effect. Like,
yeah.
So my response is to, my volley is, well, here's a 2-line poem that's really a haiku with a title. Or without a title.
Without a title.
Including the title, but if we don't count it as a title.
Right.
But yeah, so there's that. But I don't title my haiku. And actually, now that I think of it, that's kind of a lie. I think I have, actually in my book, I have technically a haiku that does have a title. So maybe I'll read that later.
Oh, well, I wish you would. And so then the other thing is, what is it about haiku, or probably anything with a structure, a sonnet maybe or something, that both for the author and the reader, does it force discipline? I mean, is there, what's the appeal of a structured poem?
What's the appeal of a structured poem? Well, in general, because that's a kind of a bold, big statement.
Yeah.
The appeal of a structured poem in general, whether it's the sonnet, the sestina, is that you have this formal principle, almost like a math that you over here, that keeps you focused.
Okay.
And lets inspiration happen over here. Because if you try to head, we were talking about this earlier, like if you try to head straight into inspiration, be like, oh, I'm going to write something great, and it's going to come, I know it, I'm just going to sit here. You might be sitting there for hours. But if you tell yourself, and I play these kind of like formal games with myself all the time, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to write 3 words per line and see where that takes me. Just start with first 3 words, then the next 3 words. And then slowly the poem starts appearing. But all I've been doing is counting 3 words at a time. So the power and the value of a structured poem is that it gives you, it distracts you from trying to say something great and lets you kind of just start saying things. And once you have that first draft, as you know, you have something to work with.
Okay, that's great.
Haiku specifically, it can be as intimidating as it is as inviting. Because it's intimidating because it's 3 lines. I have to say something as good as what I just read in 3 lines. But it's only 3 lines. Here's where it's welcoming. It's only 3 lines. The stakes are low because if I don't get it in these 3 lines, there's 3 more.
Okay.
And maybe 3 more after that. So.
And this was not a setup. As you were talking, I was trying to answer my own question. And I think there's something in us that likes, well, I was thinking about song, because, you know, song lyrics, in fact, I had this conversation with a fellow just the other day about our song lyrics poems. And so before written language, I guess we handed down information. It wasn't in song or poem. And so there's something maybe in us that's looking for that syncopation, that rhythm, something. And maybe the structure fulfills that.
Yeah. No, that gets tricky because with music, I mean, the words are written for accompaniment. Like,
exactly.
Yeah, I'm like, when people are like, oh no, Bob Dylan's lyrics are poems, I'm like, you're hearing that song. You're hearing that song in your head when you read those lyrics.
I'm with you.
And some of that doesn't hold up. And you know what? He won the Nobel, so he's not going to hurt he's not going to be hurt, or his career is going to be fine if I say, I don't think it's exactly poetry.
Yeah.
But I also stand by readers and their tastes. If someone's like, no, this is because Jim Morrison from The Doors, he's another one who gets thrown in there. And if somebody's like, well, Bob Dylan's lyrics really meant something and they got me writing, well, that's power. So I'm going to, I respect that.
Okay.
But if somebody just wants to get into an argument of like, oh no, it's legitimately,
right.
I can probably come up with an argument or two. But
yeah,
I mean, it comes down to preference. Yeah.
I think that's wonderful. In fact, the fellow that I was having the discussion with is a friend of Jim Morrison's, or was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and we were talking about Leonard Cohen. What started this was a review of Leonard Cohen's poems, and it was a harsh review. And so my friend asked me what I thought of this, and then he asked, should we judge song lyrics? Should there be a different standard for song lyrics than there are for poems? And my answer to him was just what you said. I think that poetry maybe has to be better because the song lyrics, a lot of song lyrics are really kind of silly when you read them. But the songs themselves are great because it's the combination of the instrumentation and the words. Poetry has to stand alone.
Yeah, no, exactly. Poetry has to stand alone. It's interesting, we're bringing up Jim Morrison and Leonard Cohen, because the difference between those two is then Bob Dylan. I think Bob Dylan tried to write one book and then didn't try to write one book, or tried to write another book.
Yeah.
He wrote that book, Tarantula. But you have Jim Morrison and Leonard Cohen, who I think write actual poems. They're trying to write something separate.
Yeah.
They'll include their lyrics, but then they, so at that point you've got the other thing that stands with them. If their lyrics have music to stand with them, then the aura of their celebrity kind of stands with their poems.
Right.
So if you're a big fan of like Leonard Cohen, then you're going to be like, oh, well, this is something. So you've got an extra tool to help you read that and find meaning. Which
is kind of what you alluded to earlier, and that is your work at some point becomes kind of not your work.
Yeah.
When you send it out into the world, then the reader, the listener, participates in that and brings their baggage or their experience and maybe a little bit different interpretation than you had in mind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one of those cool things. The analogy I use in class is, I mean, you get on a plane and you're on a plane with maybe like 50 to 100 people, and only 1% of that crowd of people knows how to fly the plane, right? And they're in the cockpit. Well, they should be in the cockpit.
They better be.
They better be. But language, everybody has language. Everybody uses language and is their own kind of expert at language. So we're a little foolhardy to think that as writers we can say something unique with this medium that everybody has a hand in.
Right.
But yet here we are. And so tapping into that space as writers and then allowing that for readers as well is part of why we're here.
Yeah.
If we were fussy about misinterpretations or wanting that much control, we wouldn't be writers, you know. We'd be, I guess, more interested in like legal documents where like, well, that's the final word.
Right.
But we have some complexity to dwell in.
You hit on something. Actually, Kurt Vonnegut said very much the same as you did. He said, people think they can write because they can talk. And he talked about the weekend seminar, you go to a writing conference or something, and he said, to him, that's as ludicrous as going to a weekend brain surgery conference, as if you're going to be a brain surgeon when you leave at the end of the day. So he was a little harsher.
Yeah. Well, I think at this point there's probably brain surgery on YouTube that we can probably learn from.
Oh, good.
No, the other thing I'm thinking too. There's a writer who says people will be able to pour their guts out in letters and write from like really personal, intimate letters. And I think these days it would be email,
right,
or even social media. Some people just get very like personal and in depth in social media. But then you ask them to write a poem, and they feel like they have to be poetic.
Right.
And so, especially in my intro classes, I try to like tell people like, there's that gap. Like, what's keeping you thinking you have to sound poetic and shutting your voice off, and keeping you from over here accessing this open, like, more engaged voice over here.
Yeah.
So kind of, I volley that to what Kurt Vonnegut is saying.
Yeah. We're out of time, but is there anything else that you wanted to let people know? We kind of covered the dates and the location for Paper Gardens. We're just going to have to do this again.
You know, we do if we have to, okay?
No, was there anything else?
No, not off the top of my head. Yep. Okay. March 1st is the deadline for Paper Gardens. I'm one of the judges, and I look forward to reading everybody's work.
Great.
Yeah.
So good to have you again, and we will do it again.
Oh, of course.
Whew. These half hours go way too fast. Thanks, folks, for tuning in. I guess that's what we can say that. And I'm Stephen W. Long. My website is stephenwlong.com. Write to me, whatever you'd like to do there. And we'll just see you next time. Thank you so much. Thanks.
What do you think? We done?
I don't know. You guys want to do one just with yourself without me doing the
think we're done. If they got enough. They got enough.
They got enough? Probably. Okay, sounds good.
Let's go lunch. I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could just bite too.